Hi everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming to the event. Thanks, Andres and everyone from Natasha for the invitation to come speak with you this morning. So my presentation will be a little bit different, I think, than okay, they're bringing it up here. A little bit different than some of the other ones we've had in this day. I'm primarily a writer. There we go. All good. Primarily a writer, and so what I really would like to talk about is the model of the airport. The question of airport design, in a sense, it depends upon the model, what we mean by an airport and how we understand its relationship to cities and to urbanism more generally, and specifically. And this is what I kind of would like to speak to. I'm interested in the ways, particularly in the relationships between airports and governance, and how it is that airports understood as a primary node within a network society structures the governance of flows, flows of people, flows of goods, flows of information in particular kinds of ways. And more specifically, I guess the sort of the larger argument I want to propose is that instead of seeing airports more broadly, and I think we're probably more comfortable with this than a general public might be, instead of seeing airports as a kind of appendage of the cities that they serve, to see them as something that's much more integrated within those cities, and even take a step further than that. We may have more conventionally understood airports as a kind of miniature city, right? That everything that you need to have in a city for just a short period of time might be condensed within the airport, and then that gets condensed once more as you get into the cabin space. Such that the city, the airport, is a kind of simulation of the city that it serves. What we're seeing, I think, in the argument I'll try to put forward is that, in fact, that relationship may be inverted, and that the cities that we're designing are increasingly simulations of the airports rather than the other way around. And so the airport is the moon-based version of the city. The city's becoming this as well. And so also I should say, one of the opportunities of going on the second day is you get to respond to some of the things that people said in the first day. And so some of these remarks are pretty fresh, composed last night in my hotel, and so hopefully they can contribute to the conversation more generally. The question of sovereignty and urbanism is something that I developed rather extensively in this book from MIT Press, came out last year, called The Stack on Software and Sovereignty. And just for purposes of sort of setting the stage, this book makes two basic arguments. One is that planetary scale computation has both distorted and deformed traditional Westphalian models of political geography, the distribution of discrete nation states, and that it also produces new territories in its own image. The second being that instead of seeing all these different sort of genres of planetary scale computation, smart grids, smart cities, IoT, next generation interface systems, automation, AI, so forth, as a bunch of different genres, different species of computation all spinning out on their own, we can instead see them as forming a kind of coherent whole, an accidental megastructure I call the stack. And seeing this system as more of as a totality allows us to intervene and hopefully design and designate it in different kinds of ways. So before we sort of jump into the contemporary, I just wanted to make a quick review of some of the ways in which the question of airport and the cultures of mobility more generally had been dealt with on a cultural level, and in that, if we understand airports as a kind of urbanism, and increasingly the cities that we make as variations on the innovations that may have been made first in airports, these are also cultural spaces. They are also spaces by which culture develops, and so in certain ways they've been held in clear suspicion. Marc Augé's now familiar from the commentary on non-places, his term for these airport spaces is a kind of a space of dislocation of the provisional, the in-between, liminal zones in which the mobility serves a kind of secondary time, neither here nor there, a kind of cheap time and cheap space in this as well. In contradiction to this, I would argue that airports are, in fact, should not be understood anymore as a kind of non-place, but rather as a central place, as in a way in which there's sort of the core by which the urban systems are actually developing and operating. Diller and Scafidio's suitcase studies were read as a kind of forensic meditation on the contemporary will to self, the way in which we construct the identity is constructed through these passageways through terminal systems, officially and unofficially, as the basis of a political or personal identity in through these vectorial traces. Martha Rossler's airport series, or photographs that try to freeze these trajectories and give them in themselves a kind of primary portraiture, keyframes, if you like, in this cinematic traveling point of view shot as we move through the airport space. Anthony Vidler developed his examination of modern spatial culture by dealing with looking at it in relationship to various sort of neuroses of space. He's talking about claustrophobia, agoraphobia, various walking diseases, and for Vidler, the airport was the kind of this collection of symptomatic spaces. Again, in a way, I'm trying to sort of rehearse the perspective that we'll want to take is in certain ways beyond these more conservative responses. Krzysztof Wodiczko's homeless vehicle took the primary idea of mobility as the basis of an habitation, not as something that happens secondarily, that you have a base, you're normally in stasis and only under exceptional conditions are you in motion. If we take mobility as the primary condition, the status of the airport itself becomes more central and more primary in of itself. Now, to this question of the geopolitical and to the sovereign, a lot of the more complex and controversial aspects are the states of exception that may define the political moment are also read through the airport as a cipher for this. Trevor Paglen's work on the extraordinary renditions program, for example, is also, and his photographs of military bases and airports is also part of this narrative as well. As always, so to speak, more optimistic projects such as Brian Eno's Music for Airports. And so in a certain way, I would see the remarks that I would want to make today as more in line with Eno's more optimistic take on this than any of these others. Now, okay, so straight to it then. Touch point by touch point, the airport is perhaps where the birth pangs of the stack, that armature planetary scale computation, are felt most viscerally. The arrival of any new form of political organization is always accompanied by some kind of foundational violence, a revolution of sorts, a falling of calm. And this is no less true of planetary scale computation and the jurisdictions emerging from its interfacial networks. Long ago, the ceremonial interface to the city may have been a gateway or a bridge, which when closed also shut off the city from the movement of goods and people and ideas and microbes and the rest. Those orifices to the city and periphery were where martial risk and the complexity of contact were modulated. But now the airport is the interface to the city and to the nation state. Regardless of the point of departure and regardless of how close that airport may actually be to any formal border. Airports, even in the deep national interior, contain within them legal international borders, safe zones, duty-free zones, security screens, unsafe and quarantine zones, and other liminal jurisdictions and complementary policing programs. Looking at airports as a model, as a primary model, not as an exception, as a primary model for intermodal information exchange, we see that the global mobility of people and things is possible in part because of the protocological standardization of an interfacial network of airports and cities, arranged by increments of first-person travel time, hub and spoke economics, and the flattening, affectless provisionality of boarding lounge culture, and all of the above. Movement through the airport's multi-stage rituals of filtering and sorting places paces the user through densely juxtaposed police and leisure zones, one next to the other. Security agents examine and handle your person in ways usually reserved for criminals and sans-papiers as you pose in the midst of leisure corridors where summary versions of human culture have been miniaturized into inspirational magazines and the unchallenging solicitations of snack food. Airport urbanism in general is characterized by this critical cohabitation of security and entertainment, securitized entertainment and entertaining securitization. Control is both hard and soft, as are the targets. The machine guns are real, and the terrorists' obsession with these sites is real, and the unspoken threat of being grabbed off stage to be questioned behind closed doors by state agents able to eject the user back across the world is also real. No less real are the digital departure and arrival screens, the hyper-legible black-on-yellow Helvetica signage, the precise strategic placement of coffee carts exactly so many steps from bathrooms, and again, that omnipresent media and candy matrix. Human occupation of this space, the soft enveloping of delays and digestion, in collaboration with the hard enveloping of security and filtering, is elevated now to a general principle of contemporary urban design. This easygoing layering of exceptional militarized space with the ambient landscape of airports' generic Singaporeization of the global city positions this critical interface connecting urban nodes within the expanding global sphere. It is the model for the city as rendered as information hardware and software. That is, the airport discloses without fanfare that cities are airports. Airports are not simulations of cities, rather cities are simulations of airports. It is where police deep scan your person while blending you a delicious smoothie of your choosing. And to do so, and does so without irony or contradiction or purpose or affect. But this is not only a surreal pun on despotism as universal urbanism. The business model also has to include the reactive management of individual user actions provoked by the accidentally sadistic little dramas. Now, to the stack, this scattering distribution of interfaces and the intensification of potential agencies as reflected in the increased computational capacities of each doesn't dissipate in any way the weight of the platform authorities, but it does reformulate their permissions. Perhaps counterintuitively, perhaps not, as the interfaces become ubiquitous, interface decentralization becomes the engine of cloud centralization. Interface decentralization becomes the engine of cloud centralization. And as these interfaces become channels of increasing end user management, swarm intelligence, spontaneous utility, cloud centralization becomes as well the engine of interface decentralization. The logic of the city layer of the stack then is thus both decentralized top-down and a centralized bottom-up, as well as a directed side-by-side interaction monetized as the raw social currency of cognition and circulation. Over there by gate 12, at the search field of every screen, in every hand and on every lap, while the users wait for their flights, we see this in action. That what finally empowers the interface is less its function as some coercive frame for all signification and gesture, than something uniquely, than it is because it is uniquely and relentlessly responsive to the nuances of every user's own desires, their own interests, their own intentions. And it is one because the other. So, extending then a bit on what Casey Ream talked a little bit about yesterday, about on AI at urban scale, and the question of synthetic computation as the basic building material for these apparatuses. Synthetic computation shifts what can be sensed, what can be measured, what can be calculated, what can be communicated, what stored, and does so in terms of both of what is already known before, earlier precedent agendas of administration, and also what is yet to be known and yet to be named. And it can perform feats of computational perception and cognitions, of course, at scales previously unknown. That is, instead of only seeing AI at urban scale as the application of computational intelligence to architectural programs as understood, we also see it as the generative mechanism for urban programs as yet to be conceptualized. It does so and presents, in a certain sense, a notion of the space, of its own space, as a total system that might be known and might be coherent, which introduces its own set of problems and fragility. Biosphere 2, for example, could be seen as a kind of model airport. The Biosphere 2 project, as you recall, was what a group of scientists / performance artists held themselves in this megastructure for a period of a year, which resulted in much violence and chaos. The Biosphere 2 experiments did have a winner. It was the ants. The ants who got in and who beat back the cockroaches. And the war between the two eventually made the humans in there go insane. It would make a great movie, by the way, if anyone, other than the Pauly Shore one, of course. Yeah. That is, like any domed totality, massively distributed single-mindedness, maybe that is the cognition of the ants, may be a more evolutionary better fit than individuated nuanced thinking. And if so, we can expect future literature to be, its future literature of the airport to be perhaps a very low quality. Google's charter cities, and we've been doing some discussions with them around these issues, may be drawn as much from these kinds of stigmergic chemical communications than they are by the glassy formal algorithms that we may otherwise expect. Ants organize their war machine by epidermal secretion and sensation. And our own satellite-dependent relays do as well, at least to a degree, staging the query, the result, the visualization of the result, the metadata about the query, the call and response, and so forth in this way. States involve these prostheses and are, in turn, involved by them. And they are confiscated by them, by their own mechanisms. And here we see the interface at the urban level is very literally a kind of skin. The spaces opened up, the spaces closed off by computation are defined not just by what governance chooses to see and chooses to not see, but also by what it chooses to sense and what it chooses not to sense. The distributed naming of what is sensible expresses and is expressed by this epidermal mode of governance, where securing in place and securing in motion guarantees the field of relations that things may or may not enter into. The abstracted granularity of things and the wetness of their surfaces are both preconditions for how they sense the world and how the world senses them, how they are governed, how they are secured, and how they provide security. In other words, the designability of skin is food by other means, and thereby also the state by other means. Now, I want to talk a bit about megastructures. We think of airports as not only as a megastructural form, but perhaps the entire network of airports together as a kind of distributed, discontiguous megastructural apparatus. the one that exists in a nodal form rather than as simply as a structural form. Though, let's just first stay on the grounded apparatus. At landscape scales, the stack, as I describe it, supports the consolidation of bandwidth infrastructures into these continental nodes, as well as the design of massively integrated architectural forms and programs, encapsulated into megastructures such as Foster's Apple II headquarters. Visible from a now primary satellite perspective, buildings at stack scale. These megastructures may be there to organize human habitation or object flow, but in many cases, the design problems are increasingly similar to one another, whether it's for humans or for non-humans. The end result may not be so much a neutralization of placefulness, but rather a monumental or anti-monumental hyper-inscription. A total architecture withdrawn from public city and bound by its own structural borders, gates, walls, and skins, gardens, walled gardens at a metaphysical sense, introverted from its immediate environment so as to better connect to external planetary economics on its own terms. In other words, enclaves inside of enclaves, inside of enclaves, inside of enclaves, digesting one another all the way down. For these megastructures, spatial integration is defined in the paired tongues of experience and logistics, realized by folding urban functions under a single roof and programming them, or attempting to at least, as a single system, as a self-binding and homogeneous geodetic datum. Some of the most dramatic examples are, not surprisingly, the headquarters of cloud platforms themselves. But like the Sith from Star Wars, megastructures always come in pairs, at least. Their purification of program from immediate urban situation and withdrawal into a formal singularity is always necessarily and irreducibly dependent on a doppelganger megastructure somewhere else. In the case of Apple II, it's Foxconn, or however you want to see it. So truly then, extending our riff on Foster, Foster's another one of his commissions to design printed structures on the moon. Should we decide to then categorize the Apple the Apple headquarters as part of this collection of earthbound moon bases? We see this connection. The question then remains, however, whether the design is actually properly suited to the geographic scale at which it is being asked to work. Is it instead another arc for paranoid withdrawal, designed to sustain life, even if that life is a hostile alien planet, and even if that hostile alien planet is our Anthropocenic Earth? So, unlike real moon bases, for example, many of these such structures are designed not only for permanent or semi-permanent housing of humans in settled encampments. They are rather, in a way, switching stations through which we may pass on our way. We're not captured by them. They are media for us to move through. Their scale and centrality, in fact, demands this passage. And the arcs of our movement are composed in their bending towards the gigantic nodes to which they are connected. In other words, we don't reside in Foster's Beijing airport. We merely pass through its digestive system if we are to reach the next level of our passage into or out of China. Other megastructures are not only impermanent, they are also designed for the mediation, they're designed not for the mediation of humans at all. But most of the largest buildings in the world accommodate and express the algorithmic resorting and distribution of inanimate objects, commodities and cargoes from sites of extraction to assembly to consumption and back again into landfills or the production cycle. The relative freedom of the objects to cross borders into global materials into themselves is, of course, far less restricted than the passage of people, bound as we are by the burdens of rights and restrictions of formal political citizenship and the dramas of sovereignty that thus entail. And so in some ways, the physical object becomes the exemplary non-city, the exemplary user of the systems that we consider, as the most intensive impact of algorithmic capital into the physical realm of such systems is on the molecular reassemblage of standardized matter, its global redistribution as manufactured objects, and the computational optimization of their itineraries through global supply chains. All of these enjoy their own kinds of megastructural theater. This object-oriented economy of molecular logistics is expressed in, quote, planetary supersurfaces, such as warehouses so large that their floors have been laser leveled against the curvature of the Earth. Instead of walls and windows, these spaces are programmed by other forms of ubiquitous perception. Okay, lastly then, I want to then say a few words on the question of security, which had been raised a bit yesterday, but perhaps not as directly as it should be. For the question of what, if we take the question of the design of airports as a model for design of cities rather than the other way around, the role and function of security in airports can't be really, it has to be spoken to directly. That is, another trend that we might see is the confusion of a military and civilian space, and therefore confusion of military and civilian life, a confusion that works both ways. Airports are, after all, patrolled by armed men in uniforms, and everyday phone calls are suspected as being technologies in an open-ended war against an undefinable enemy. This goes hand in hand with the securitization around issues of normal safety. Planes are better than horse-drawn carriages, at least to the extent that plane crashes are better than horse-drawn carriage crashes, except for those involved. While the power of technological system is to organize the world in its image, while this capacity may increase, its inability to prevent its own inevitable breakdown remains constant and irreducible. But the abdication of agency regarding an event as dramatic as a plane crash, shifted now from human pilot to random systemic fissure, is a hard pill for many to swallow, and for some even insulting to the economic dignity of humanity. And so likewise, the airport is asked to play, and has been asked to play, the central stage for public space, a request underlined by the securitarian reaction to 9/11. Concurrent with the oil crisis in the mid-70s, airports were, as we know, reconstructed to conform to the defense imperatives against hijacking. Buildings were built according to traditional technical constraints, but were designed to minimize the risk of contamination, and terminals were planned to discriminate against a sterile zone and non-sterile, a sterile zone of departures and non-sterile zone of arrivals. All circuits and circuit breaks, passengers, baggage, and freight submitted to a discriminatory interior versus exterior transit system. And so the state's first and last gateway in and out, the airport became, like the fort, the harbor, or the train station, the home of a crowd-centric regulation. One passenger civilian gains access to the city no longer through a gate, an arc of triumph, but rather through an electronic audience system, whose users are not so much inhabitants or privileged residents as they are interlocutors in permanent transit. And more recently, it matures into fields for more intensive testing, control, and/or observation. And so unlike the monotony of the hijacker sitcom, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey cast the very future of the species as a kind of metaphysical layover. Or Chris Marker's vision of the end of the world begins and ends on the jetty at Orly, next to a magazine stand and pretzel cart, which I suppose just goes to show. In the post-colonial implosion of peripheries into core, the airport and sometimes the individual jet plane were restaged as zones of destiny. Seldom are commercial jets actually procured as artillery in opposition air force, though as we know sometimes they are. Usually the plane instead becomes a bunker, sometimes a stage set, sometimes a missile, sometimes it is made into a sort of living ruin of a civilization in disrepair. And so to provoke enemy responses to spring, it used to provoke enemy responses to spring into reaction according to a script, itself the desired effect. And in these dramas, then, of security and counter-security, of simulation and dissimulation, it's not the temple, not the bank, not the church, not the public plaza. The airport becomes the local assembly of global authority. And yet, in which the miniaturization of the city, which is itself a miniaturization of the world system, itself a miniaturization of that cabin space, to hijack one is to purloin the other. And yet, it's not certain anymore whether, even for true believers, this notion of the totality miniaturized even holds. To capture its token doesn't necessarily really fly anymore. And in this nervous self-contradiction, the urban public body is redefined by its supposed relation to imminent violence by extra-state actors, but with some design flair and ingenuity. It's another mode of the paranoid style of spatial politics, one in which urbanism's primary use cases are always, on the one hand, the tax-paying citizen who may actually be a suicide bomber, and on the other, the symbolism of a responsible and transparent institution held up in and out of some sort of unauthorized reach. The attempts to reconcile the performative and symbolic demands of security and the open society with the same architectonic entity are held in this suspension. Whether a building or a park or a city, it means interweaving openness and closeness into the complicated patterns of open and shut. Bulletproof glass that makes a building's skin transparent. Massive car bomb deterrents as public art in pedestrian plazas. Evacuation corridors that link floors with sculptural public walkways that also sort and filter crowds into firewalled zones in case of emergency and more. The combination of enlightenment transparency of publics and gated bunkers with weaponized interfaces is a special design solution that we could call the glass fort. Thank you very much.